Pre-contact Australia was home to several 100,000 Indigenous people, spread across the continent speaking hundreds of languages and dialects, trading with Macassans from what is Indonesia today, and amongst each other, moving across the land with transition zones between individual nations, of which there were over 200. At the beginning of colonization, in 1788, Anglo-Celtic civilization with all its trappings was transposed to a new land, with little or no recognition of its original inhabitants. The government at the time adhered to the doctrine of terra nullius, or empty land, declaring that Australia was devoid of human inhabitants and thus belonged to no one, claiming it all for the British Crown. Australia became a settler society without treaty with its indigenous people. Early migration, apart from the penal colony, was settlers given land to pioneer new settlement of the colony, dominated by British subjects. This changed with the gold rush in the mid-19th century, when a major influx of Chinese men seeking their fortune on the goldfields stirred an anti-Chinese and anti-immigration backlash. Chinese immigrants were predominantly men and often had close relationships with Aboriginal people in remote Australia, something we'll talk about in episode 4 when we discuss David Trigger and Richard Martin's research in northern Queensland. Meanwhile, some Australian states tried to limit Chinese immigration, forcing them to disembark in neighbouring states and go on vast overland tracks to the goldfields. At the same time, the blackbirding slave trade around the Pacific Islands brought slaves to work on plantations like sugar palm to Australia. Amongst British immigrants and their descendants, the bush ethos based on mateship on the frontier grew in importance, as did demand for identity of an independent nation, independent of Great Britain that is, which led to Federation of Australia in 1901. 1901, the White Australia policy, a range of policies that favoured immigration from certain European countries and limited immigration from Asia and the Pacific, was written into law, with requirements of language tests, which could be given in any language to prospective immigrants, thereby privileging some ethnicities and discriminating against others. In the 1910s, especially the First World War, saw the birth of the ANZAC, or Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, myth or legend at Gallipoli. At Gallipoli, a battle was lost on the shores of modern-day Turkey, where Australian and New Zealand troops fought together for Great Britain, but also under their own banner, that has spawned a sense of nationalism and pride in contemporary Australia. The 1920s saw the resumption of European migration, especially from southern Europe. In the 1930s, refugees arrived, fleeing Europe from discrimination and persecution, as well as another impending world war. Following the Second World War, Australia embarked on large immigration schemes to build the nation with massive infrastructure projects. This is underscored by the populate or perish policy that demanded for more people to settle in Australia. Post-war immigration reinforced the vocational stereotypes of immigrants as factory workers, building and farm labourers. Assisted passage schemes like the £10 POMs also increased numbers of immigration. In this scheme, both the United Kingdom and Australian governments offered subsidised passage for British subjects to Australia. The 1960s saw a swing to Eastern European migration, from countries like Poland, Yugoslavia and Hungary. There was in fact a progressive swing in migration, expanding from the British white Anglo-immigrant to others willing and able to come and contribute to the Australian nation-building project. Another milestone is 1967, when a referendum was successfully held to remove some of the discriminating language and provisions in the Constitution that discriminated against Indigenous people in Australia. The referendum started a slow process of recognition of the shared history of domination, subjugation and racism, which is ongoing. In the 1970s, the Vietnam War triggered many Vietnamese refugees to travel by boat to safety as so-called boat people, and many got resettled as refugees to Australia. This marked a major shift from European to Asian immigration. In the 1980s, multiculturalism emerged as a social concept, especially around the bicentennial, the 200-year celebration of the modern Australian nation. Advertising campaigns and festivals celebrated the multicultural makeup of modern Australia. This was supported by the Hawke-Keating Labour governments between 1983 and 1996, which were broadly pro-multiculturalism. In 1975 and 1980, the Special Broadcasting Service, radio and TV station, were launched catering specifically to multicultural audiences. The 1990s and 2000s saw an increase in migration flows, especially skilled migration. However, the mood was and remains dominated by an aversion to people coming to Australia by irregular means, especially by boat. Asylum seekers have continued to make their way to Australia to seek asylum, but recent governments have focused not on their plight, but on securing the borders and making them impenetrable. This sentiment is best summed up by former Prime Minister John Howard's now infamous words about people coming to Australia by boat. He said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come." This focus on border security persists today. So in conclusion, we've seen a fluctuating response to immigration, one between acceptance, promotion, and opposition. To delve deeper into Australian attitudes, we caught up with anthropologist Ghassan Haj to discuss these issues.